My mother blamed and resented me for my father's near-fatal accident. Even upon my father's death, I remained a thorn in her side. I've always known my life wasn't going to be the kind you see in feel-good movies. Adopted into a family where the age gap could easily fit another generation between us, I was the anomaly at family gatherings, the young face among wrinkled smiles, the boy in a world of history I could barely relate to. My dad, born in 1927, was a World War II veteran, a man whose silence told stories his words never could. My mom, a decade his junior, carried a gentleness eroded by time, and a deafness on her left side that made her world as lopsided as her hearing. I was 34 now, reflecting on a slice of my life from about 15 years ago that had shifted the course of my relationship with them, especially with my mom. That period became a chasm that widened with time, filled with silence, misunderstandings. The incident that set everything off was as mundane as it was tragic. It happened one night when the comfort of sleep was abruptly replaced by a startling thump from my dad's room. In the haze of half-sleep, I reasoned it away as one of our animals knocked something over, or perhaps my dad, in his nightly bathroom ritual, had accidentally dropped his cane. I rolled over, choosing the warmth of my bed over investigating. That decision would haunt me for years. Morning light brought the harsh reality crashing down. My nephew's scream pierced the usual quiet, a sound so filled with terror that it catapulted me from my bed. Rushing into my dad's room, the scene before me was one I'd replay over countless times. My dad, lying beside his bed, a blanket wrapped tightly around his neck, his skin turning a worrying shade of blue. Adrenaline kicked in. I managed to lift him back onto the bed, unwrapping the blanket from around his neck, his breath shallow and labored. The call to the ambulance was a blur, as was their arrival and the subsequent rush to the hospital. The layout of our house, something so ordinary, became a detail of contention, a piece of the puzzle in the blame that was cast my way. My room was adjacent to my father's, a fact that somehow was supposed to arm me with the ability to foresee and prevent the accident. Half asleep, my mind did not leap to disaster. It didn't occur to me that my father could fall out of bed despite his health issues. After his third stroke, my adoptive parents made the difficult decision to sleep in separate bedrooms. His mobility was impaired, and she needed her rest to be able to care for him during the day. This arrangement, while practical, created an unintended isolation from my father. His room was upstairs, while my mother's was directly below. That night, as fate would have it, my adoptive mother was turned onto her good ear, her deaf side exposed to the ceiling, and thus to any sounds that might have come from my father's room above. She didn't hear the fall, just as I didn't. Her deafness on her left side was not something new. We had all adapted to it in various ways over the years. Yet, in the aftermath, it felt like a cruel irony that neither of us heard the one sound that mattered most. The guilt of that night weighed heavily on me. The what-ifs haunted my thoughts. What if I had been fully awake? It was as if my proximity to my father's room that night endowed me with a responsibility I was unaware I had, a guard duty I failed. Following the incident, my dad's health spiraled, leading to his admission to an old folks' home for veterans. The air in our home thickened with tension, as if every word and gesture were filtered through a lens of blame. My mother, her grief manifesting as anger, directed her fury towards me, the convenient target for her swirling storm of emotions. It didn't matter that the fall was an accident, a tragic twist of fate that I, in my half-asleep state, could not have foreseen or prevented. In her eyes, I was the culprit, the reason her husband, my adoptive father, now lay in a bed at the old folks' home for veterans. His robust spirit dimmed. The initial conflict was a crack in the dam of our family dynamics, releasing a flood of long-suppressed frustrations and resentments. My mother's blame became the soundtrack of my life at home, a constant reminder of that night. Conversations were minefields. Each word I said weighed and found wanting, each silence loaded with accusation. The more she blamed, the more I withdrew, retreating into a shell of indifference to protect myself from the pain of her words. The moment I decided to join the army felt like the first step toward something new, a path that was entirely mine. But that dream quickly became entangled in the web of my family's expectations and my mother's fear of being left alone. My mother, wielding her grief like a weapon, saw my departure not as a young man's quest for his own path, but as abandonment. After filling out the necessary forms, ready to embark on this new journey, my mother took matters into her own hands in a way that left me stunned and betrayed. She spoke to the army recruiter, a conversation I was not privy to, but the consequences of which I felt deeply. My mother told them I had changed my mind about joining, that I couldn't go through with it. Her words, authoritative and final, painted a picture of doubt and indecision that was entirely hers, not mine. It was a deliberate act, one rooted in her desperation to keep me close, to ensure I remained at home to take care of my father. The realization that my mother would go to such lengths to keep me anchored to home, to a role she deemed suitable, was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The betrayal of that act, her going behind my back to alter the course of my future, strained our relationship even further. It was a clear sign that my desires, my aspirations, were secondary to her need to keep the family unit intact, regardless of the cost to my own dreams and autonomy. Faced with the collapse of my plans and the unbearable atmosphere at home, I made a decision that would set the course of my life for the next few years. College, a backup plan I had never intended to use, became my lifeline. The acceptance letter from a university 200 miles away was my ticket out of the stifling environment of blame and resentment. I packed my life into a few boxes, not knowing when or if I would return, driven by a desperate need for space and a fresh start. Life away from home was a stark contrast to what I had known. College presented a world of opportunities and challenges, but the freedom it afforded came with its own set of difficulties. The shadow of my family's turmoil followed me, a cloud that darkened even the brightest days. To support myself and avoid the need to return home, I took on 2 jobs, juggling academics and work in a relentless cycle that left little room for rest or reflection. Balancing work and school wasn't easy, but it became my new normal. The campus library was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where I could lose myself among the stacks of books and the quiet hum of students studying. Here, I wasn't the son blamed for his father's accident. I was just another student, trying to make ends meet and build a future. The job required meticulous attention to detail, sorting, shelving, and ensuring that the library remained a place of order and learning. It was a quiet, steady job that contrasted sharply with the chaos of my personal life. The local cafe, on the other hand, was a bustling hub of activity. Here, I was a barista, a friendly face behind the counter crafting lattes and cappuccinos for a stream of customers. The pace was relentless, the environment lively and sometimes overwhelming. Yet there was joy in the rush, in the smiles of satisfied customers, and in the camaraderie with my co-workers. This job taught me resilience, the ability to keep smiling even when I was tired, and to find peace in the rhythm of the work. These jobs, while exhausting, provided me with a sense of purpose. They were my escape from the turmoil back home, a way to prove to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet. The satisfaction of earning my own way, of being responsible for my successes and failures, was empowering. Amidst the long hours and the tired evenings, I found moments of happiness and pride. Being busy, immersing myself in work and school, helped me to momentarily forget the bitterness of the past, allowing me to focus on building a new future for myself. Yet, the question of my departure, of whether my actions had been justified or selfish, remained unanswered. A puzzle I was still working to solve. The emotional toll of separation and blame was heavier than I anticipated. The physical distance from my family did little to ease the burden of guilt and unresolved anger. I missed my father, the man who had, in his quiet way, been a source of strength and stability. My mother's accusations echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the rift that had grown between us. I found myself questioning my decisions, wondering if I had indeed been the jerk for choosing to leave, for putting distance between myself and the family drama. After graduation, I landed a stable job, the kind that felt both like a triumph and a compromise. It was a steady climb away from the tumultuous past into a semblance of adult life, marked by paychecks and small freedoms. The rare trips back home were exercises in tension, the air thick with unspoken recriminations, and the heavy presence of my mother's enduring blame. It wasn't that I didn't want to see my father, it was the opposite. My heart ached for the man who seemed to shrink a little more with each passing day, his vitality sapped by illness and the domestic strife that buzzed around him like an unrelenting swarm. Driven by a mix of guilt and love, I set a new goal for myself: to earn enough money to afford the best possible treatment for my father. It became an obsession, this idea that financial success could somehow translate into a redemption of sorts, a way to make amends for my perceived failings. My career became more than just a job. It was a means to an end. Each promotion, each raise a step closer to providing my father with the care he deserved. The irony of working tirelessly to support someone who, through no fault of their own, felt like a stranger, wasn't lost on me. Despite my attempts to heal and move forward, the news of my father's passing knocked me back to square one. That night I received a call at an hour so late, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. It was my aunt on the other end. her voice steady but laced with an unmistakable sorrow. "It's about your dad," she said. And in that instant, I felt the ground beneath me shift. My father had passed away after a prolonged illness, an event we all saw looming on the horizon, yet hoped would somehow steer clear of our shores. I was hundreds of miles away, wrapped in the cocoon of my new life, far from the home that felt more like a battleground than a sanctuary in recent years. The pain of the news was a sharp jab to the gut, a mix of grief and guilt swirling in a tempest I couldn't contain. My relationship with my family, particularly with my mom, had been strained at best, severed at worst. Yet, the finality of my father's departure cut through those tangled feelings, reminding me that beneath the resentment and misunderstandings there was love. Raw, unfiltered love for the man who, though not of my blood, had been a pillar in my life. I didn't have time to pack. There was no moment to sit and ponder what to bring. The urgency of the situation propelled me forward, my actions driven by a singular need to get back as quickly as possible. The bus was the first mode of transportation I could find, a decision made not out of convenience but desperation. I boarded at dawn, the early morning light casting long shadows that mirrored the heaviness in my heart. The journey was a blur, each mile stretching on as I grappled with the reality of my father's death and the inevitable confrontation with my family. I rehearsed conversations in my head, anticipated accusations and prepared defenses, all the while battling the growing knot of sorrow for the loss of a man who had shaped so much of who I had become. Arriving at the funeral home, the gravity of the situation finally settled in. I saw him there, lying in repose, a tranquility on his face that had eluded him in his final years. My father looked at peace, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me. The sight of him, so still and serene, broke through the walls I built around my heart. The grievances that once seemed insurmountable now appeared petty in the face of such profound loss. My eyes traced the lines of his face, each wrinkle a testament to the life he had lived, the battles he had fought, and the love he had given, however imperfectly. Standing before him, I was acutely aware of the finality of death, how it leaves no room for apologies, for mending fences, for saying all the things left unsaid. The weight of my unresolved feelings towards my family, my mother's harsh words, and the guilt of my perceived negligence crushed me. In that moment, I wished for nothing more than to turn back time, to relive those last days with the knowledge of their fleeting nature, to offer words of love instead of silence. My father's passing was a great loss, a void that would never be filled. Yet it also served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, and the importance of forgiveness, understanding, and compassion. As I stood there, amidst the somber faces of those who had known and loved him, I realized that holding on to anger and resentment served no purpose but to prolong the pain. In that moment, all I felt was the piercing ache of missing a man who had been more than just a father figure. He had been a guide, a confidant, and, in his own way, a source of unwavering support. Standing at the end of the somber line, I extended my hand, offering a quiet thank you to each person who had come to pay their respects to my father. The room was filled with a heavy silence, punctuated only by soft murmurs and the occasional shuffle of feet. It was a moment of closure, a final goodbye to a man who had been a constant in my life, despite our complexities and the distance that had grown between us. But that silence shattered when my mother's voice, sharp and laden with grief and accusation, pierced the air. "His death is partly due to him," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "He's a cruel person for ignoring his father, a selfish person for going to college and not taking care of his family." Her words, like daggers, cut through the solemn atmosphere, turning heads and drawing a collective breath from the gathered mourners. The accusation was a blow, not because it was new but because of its public nature and the timing. It was a reopening of wounds that had never fully healed, a reminder of the years of blame and misunderstanding that had driven a wedge between us. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. It was her initial accusations that had pushed me away, that had made me feel like an outsider in my own home. And now, as we stood together in grief, she chose to resurrect those accusations, to paint me as a villain in the eyes of those who had come to mourn my father. I felt my heart break all over again, not just for the loss of my father, but for the loss of what our family could have been. The sadness was overwhelming, a tide of emotion that threatened to pull me under. I had come to say goodbye, to find some semblance of peace in the wake of my father's passing. But instead, I was met with public condemnation from the one person whose acceptance I had longed for. The eyes of the guests were on me, some filled with sympathy, others with judgment. In that moment, I realized the futility of trying to defend myself, of trying to explain my side of the story to those who had only heard one version. The damage was done. My mother's words had painted me as the culprit, the son who had abandoned his family in their time of need. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew the weight of the guilt I had carried, the countless times I had replayed that night in my head, wondering if things could have been different if I had acted sooner. I also knew the pain of being pushed away, of being blamed for something beyond my control. It was a pain that had driven me to seek distance, to build a life away from the constant reminders of my supposed failures. As I stood there, amidst the whispered conversations and sideways glances, I realized that my mother's words, though hurtful, could not define me. They were a reflection of her grief, her inability to cope with the loss of her husband and the strained relationship with her son. It was a sadness that I shared, but I also knew that carrying the burden of her blame would not bring my father back, nor would it heal the rift between us. There I was, sitting on the porch of the funeral home, my tears falling silently. The weight of my mother's public accusation at the funeral had left me shattered, alone with my grief and the sting of her words. It felt as though the ground beneath me had opened up, swallowing the last remnants of what family meant to me. My aunt found me there, her presence a gentle reminder that I wasn't completely forsaken. "What's the matter?" she asked, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the harshness I had just endured inside. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The dam broke and I told her everything. How my mother blamed me for my father's death, how she labeled me cruel and selfish in front of everyone. The words poured out, raw and unfiltered, the pain and confusion I had been carrying for so long finally finding an outlet. My aunt listened quietly, her expression one of sadness and understanding. When I finished, she sighed, a sound that carried so much, sorrow for her sister's actions and empathy for my situation. "Your mom is grieving and lashing out," she finally said. "But that doesn't excuse her words or how she's treated you." And I then shared with her the story of the night my dad had fallen out of bed, the sound that had roused me from sleep, the horrifying discovery in the morning, and my frantic efforts to help. It was a confession of sorts, an attempt to explain my side, to make her see that I wasn't the villain my mother portrayed me to be. To my surprise, my aunt took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You are my new adopted son now," she declared, her words not just a statement but a promise, a pledge of support and acceptance that I hadn't realized I was so desperate for. "And your mother, she doesn't deserve you. Not if she can't see the truth and pain in your heart." Her words were a balm to my soul, offering a sliver of solace in the midst of my turmoil. Here was family, not bound by blood or obligation, but chosen, offering me a place when I felt I had nowhere left to turn. As we sat there, the cool evening air wrapping around us, I realized this was the beginning of a new chapter. My aunt's acceptance and understanding gave me something to hold on to, a glimmer of hope in a time darkened by loss and misunderstanding. It was a reminder that family isn't always about who raises you, but who stands by you when the ground gives way beneath your feet. In that moment, I understood that while my relationship with my mother might never be repaired, I wasn't as alone as I thought. Life would go on, and with my aunt's support, I might just find a way to navigate this new reality. Despite the pain and heartbreak, her words offered a path forward, a chance to rebuild from the ruins left by my father's passing and my mother's blame.